Angela had always lived a life where every day was a battle. She grew up in a small neighborhood where opportunities rarely knocked on anyone's door. Her father had passed away when she was very young, and her mother worked as a cook in different homes to keep food on the table. Angela was the eldest of 3 siblings, and from the time she was a child, responsibility rested heavily on her shoulders. She had to grow up fast, not because she wanted to, but because life forced her to. By the time she was only 16, she had already learned what sacrifice meant. She often skipped meals so her younger brother and sister could eat, and she learned how to mend old clothes to make them last another year. When she finally got a job as a maid in the house of a millionaire, she thought it would be a blessing. The mansion was nothing like the small worn-down house where she lived with her siblings. The floors were polished marble, the chandeliers sparkled brighter than the stars outside, and the expensive furniture looked like it belonged in magazines. Angela never dreamed of having such things, she only dreamed of being able to pay rent on time and buy enough food so her family never went hungry again. The mansion belonged to Richard Thompson, a wealthy businessman known across the city. People respected him, admired his success, and some feared his temper. Richard lived alone with his young son Ethan after losing his wife years ago. He was a man who valued order, discipline, and loyalty. He liked things to be done exactly his way, and Angela quickly realized that he noticed everything. If a glass was not in the right place, if the floor had the smallest speck of dust, Richard would know. At first, Angela was terrified that she would lose the job. But over time, she learned to adjust. She was not like the other staff members. Many of them looked at her with suspicion because she was quiet, humble, and poor. Some thought she would steal, but she never once touched anything that didn't belong to her. She dusted the Lamborghini in the garage with the same respect she had when she polished the family pictures in the living room. Sometimes she looked at the shiny black car and smiled, wondering what it must feel like to sit inside it. To her, it wasn't just a car, it was a symbol of a life so far from hers that she couldn't even imagine living it. Angela's days were long. She woke up before sunrise, packed her siblings' school lunches, and then hurried to the mansion. She worked from morning till late evening, cleaning, ironing, cooking, and taking care of small tasks around the house. When she went home, she still had to help her brother with homework and cook dinner for her family. She never complained, though. She believed hard work was her only path forward. Every coin she earned was carefully saved. She even denied herself small joys like new clothes or sweets, because she always thought of her siblings first. Despite her struggles, there was a warmth in Angela that never faded. Ethan, the millionaire's son, felt that warmth more than anyone. Ethan was only 10 years old, playful and curious, but lonely. His father was always busy, either at meetings or traveling for work. The boy had no mother and few friends, so Angela often became his companion. She read him bedtime stories, helped him with his school projects, and even played soccer with him in the garden when the other staff were too busy. Ethan trusted her deeply, and in his innocent way, he loved her like family. But not everyone saw Angela with the same kindness. Some of the mansion's workers whispered behind her back. They thought it strange that she spent so much time with Ethan. Others accused her of pretending to be loyal just to get closer to the rich man's family. Angela heard the whispers, but she never answered them. She believed the truth didn't need defending. As long as Ethan was happy and safe, and as long as her siblings at home had food, she could bear the rest. Her life outside the mansion was nothing like the glittering world she entered each morning. She lived in a small house with peeling paint and a roof that leaked when it rained. Her siblings shared a single room, and often there was no electricity. At night, she would light a small candle so her brother could study. Many times, she felt exhausted, but she reminded herself that her sacrifice was not in vain. She dreamed that one day her brother would become a teacher or a doctor, and her sister would not have to work as a maid like her. These dreams kept her alive. Even though she lived in poverty, Angela's heart was rich with kindness. Once, when she received her pay, she noticed an old woman begging on the street. Though she had only enough money for her family's needs, she gave the woman a small portion. She couldn't walk past suffering without doing something. Perhaps that was why Ethan trusted her so much, because children can always feel who truly cares for them. Richard, the millionaire, rarely spoke to Angela except to give orders. To him, she was just another employee, one who happened to do her job quietly and efficiently. But in small ways, he noticed her honesty. One day, she found a gold watch in the garden and returned it immediately to him. Another time, she discovered a wallet in the back seat of a car and handed it over without hesitation. Richard didn't say much, but inside, he respected her. He didn't show it, because he was a man who believed showing emotions was weakness. For Angela, the Lamborghini in the garage was a mystery she admired from a distance. It was always spotless, always shining under the lights. She had never touched the steering wheel, never dared to sit inside. In her mind, the car was untouchable, like a jewel locked away in a box. She didn't even know how to drive, because in her world, cars like that didn't exist. She only knew buses, long walks, and sometimes borrowing a neighbor's old bicycle. Still, she often told Ethan stories about how cars could race faster than the wind. Ethan would laugh and ask, "Would you ever drive one, Angela?" She always shook her head and said, "No, Ethan. That car belongs to your father. It's not for people like me." She meant it too, never imagining that one day she would sit in that very car, not for herself, but for Ethan's life. Her days continued with the same rhythm. Work, family, sacrifice, and little moments of happiness with Ethan. She didn't know that life was quietly preparing her for the moment when all her courage, love, and honesty would be tested. She didn't know that one decision would change everything, not just her own life, but also the life of the millionaire and his son. The day had begun like any other. Angela woke up before the sun rose, as she always did, and prepared breakfast for her younger siblings before leaving for work. She hurried through the quiet streets, carrying her small worn-out bag, and reached the mansion on time. The morning was filled with her usual tasks: dusting the shelves, polishing the marble floor, and helping the cook prepare the table for Richard Thompson's breakfast. Ethan, the millionaire's young son, was cheerful as always, running around the hallways with his little toy car. He stopped to wave at Angela, and she smiled back warmly before returning to her chores. To her, this was just another ordinary day. She had no idea that by the evening, everything would change. The afternoon passed quickly. Richard had gone to his office for a meeting, leaving Ethan in the care of the house staff. Angela was folding laundry in one of the upstairs rooms when she suddenly heard a loud, panicked cry echoing through the mansion. Her heart skipped a beat. She dropped the laundry and ran down the stairs as fast as she could. The sound was coming from the backyard. When she pushed open the glass door leading outside, her eyes widened in horror. Ethan was lying on the grass, clutching his throat. His face had turned pale, and he was gasping desperately for air. One of the gardeners stood nearby, frozen in shock, while another staff member shouted Ethan's name over and over. Angela didn't hesitate. She rushed to the boy's side, kneeling on the grass. His little body trembled as he tried to breathe. She had seen something like this once before when her sister had a food allergy. She knew it was serious. "What happened?" Angela shouted, her voice shaking. "He ate something," one of the workers stammered. "We don't know, he just started choking and collapsed." Angela's heart raced. She remembered that Ethan had a history of allergies. She had once overheard Richard mentioning it to the doctor. She looked around quickly, searching for someone to act. "Call an ambulance," she yelled. The housekeeper was already on the phone, speaking nervously. After a few seconds, She lowered it and said with panic in her voice, "They said it will take 20 minutes to get here." 20 minutes. Angela's stomach twisted. She looked down at Ethan, who was getting weaker by the second. His breathing was shallow, his lips turning slightly blue. 20 minutes was too long. She knew that if they waited, he might not survive. Angela's hands shook, but her mind became clear. She couldn't wait for someone else to save him. The driver wasn't home. The other staff were panicking, shouting, and running in circles, but no one was doing anything to take Ethan to the hospital immediately. Angela felt her pulse in her ears. She knew she had to make a choice. Her eyes darted toward the garage, where the sleek black Lamborghini rested. The very car she had admired from afar for months. Her heart pounded at the thought. She had never driven a luxury car in her life. In fact, she had barely driven at all, only practicing on a neighbor's old vehicle when she was younger. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Ethan needed to reach the hospital, and that car was the only chance. Angela scooped Ethan into her arms. His little head leaned against her shoulder as she carried him, running toward the garage. The other staff shouted after her, shocked and confused. "Where are you going? What are you doing?" one of them cried out. But Angela didn't stop. Every second counted. She placed Ethan gently in the passenger seat and quickly fastened the seat belt around his tiny frame. His breathing was faint, his eyes half closed. Angela felt tears burn in her eyes, but she forced herself to stay strong. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the keys from the hook on the wall. She slid into the driver's seat, staring at the polished steering wheel that had always seemed untouchable. For a moment, fear gripped her. What if she couldn't control the car? What if she crashed? What if she failed? But then she looked at Ethan, so fragile and helpless, and she knew there was no choice. She turned the key. The engine roared to life, louder than anything she had ever heard. The gatekeeper gawked in disbelief as the Lamborghini sped out of the driveway. Angela's hands clutched the wheel tightly, her knuckles white. The car leapt forward with incredible power, almost frightening her, but she held on. The city streets blurred around her as she pressed the accelerator. She had never felt such speed, and fear coursed through her veins, but she didn't let it stop her. All she thought of was Ethan's survival. People on the street turned their heads, shocked to see a maid in uniform behind the wheel of a millionaire's car. Some pointed, others shouted, but Angela ignored them. Her eyes darted from the road to Ethan. "Hold on, Ethan," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Stay with me. We're almost there." The traffic lights seemed like enemies standing in her way. At one red light, cars were lined up, blocking her path. Angela honked the horn repeatedly, leaning forward as if sheer willpower could clear the road. Drivers glared at her until they noticed the child in the passenger seat. Some moved aside, and she shot forward, narrowly missing the bumpers of other cars. At one point, a police officer signaled for her to stop. Her heart nearly froze, but she pulled down the window and shouted with all the strength in her voice, "He's dying. Please, let me through." The officer looked at the boy, saw his pale face, and quickly waved her on. Angela pushed the pedal harder, her heart pounding in rhythm with the roaring engine. Every turn, every swerve, every passing second felt like a battle between fear and determination. Angela had never been so terrified in her life, yet she had never felt so sure of her purpose. For the first time, she wasn't just a maid working quietly in someone else's house. She was the only person standing between Ethan and death. The hospital finally appeared in the distance. Angela's hands ached from gripping the wheel, but she pressed forward. She pulled into the emergency entrance so fast that the tires screeched. Doctors and nurses rushed out as soon as they saw Ethan being carried in. Angela stumbled out of the car, cradling him in her arms, and shouted, "Help him. Please." The medical team took Ethan from her and rushed him inside. Angela stood outside, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her body trembling from the adrenaline. For a long moment, she couldn't move. She leaned against the car, tears falling silently. She had done everything she could. Now Ethan's life was in the hands of the doctors. Behind her, strangers whispered in amazement. Some recognized the car as Richard Thompson's Lamborghini. They wondered who the woman was and why she had driven the child here. But Angela didn't hear their words. She closed her eyes, praying with all her heart for Ethan to live. The emergency doors swung shut as the doctors rushed Ethan inside, leaving Angela standing helplessly in the corridor. Her heart felt like it was going to burst out of her chest. She could still hear the boy's weak breaths echoing in her ears, as if reminding her of the precious seconds she had raced against. Her hands shook violently, and her clothes were damp with sweat. She tried to calm herself, but her body refused to listen. For a few moments, she simply stood frozen, unable to process everything that had just happened. The sound of hurried footsteps and beeping machines filled the air around her. Nurses darted past, carrying medical charts and equipment, while voices called out urgent instructions. Angela pressed her back against the cold white wall of the waiting area, staring blankly at the floor. Her whole body ached, but her mind was still racing faster than the Lamborghini she had driven. Had she reached in time? Was Ethan going to be all right? She clasped her trembling hands together and whispered a silent prayer, begging for the boy's life. It was strange how quickly things had changed. Just hours ago, she was folding laundry and laughing softly at Ethan's playful chatter. Now she was in a hospital, her heart weighed down with fear. She replayed the drive in her head again and again, barely believing she had done it. She had broken every rule she had lived by, sat behind the wheel of a car she never imagined touching, and sped through the city like her life depended on it. But it wasn't her life, it was Ethan's. That thought alone made every terrifying second worth it. A nurse finally came out and asked, "Are you the one who brought the boy?" Angela nodded quickly, her voice too shaky to answer. The nurse's face softened. "You did the right thing. If you hadn't brought him here so fast, things might have been very different. He's being treated now. Please wait here." Those words gave Angela a small glimmer of hope. She sat down on one of the stiff chairs in the waiting area, her hands still folded tightly in her lap. Around her, people came and went, families crying, doctors rushing, patients being wheeled in. Yet she felt strangely invisible, as though she didn't belong to this world of polished floors and expensive machines. She was just a maid in a borrowed space, sitting outside a room where decisions of life and death were being made. Minutes felt like hours. Every time the door opened, her head shot up, expecting news. Her eyes burned from holding back tears, but she didn't let them fall. She thought of Richard Thompson, the millionaire. What would he say when he found out she had taken his car? Would he believe her when she explained? Or would he see her as nothing more than a thief, a servant who dared to touch what wasn't hers? The thought made her stomach twist. But then she reminded herself none of that mattered right now. All that mattered was Ethan's survival. Her memory drifted back to the ride. The way people stared, the way the police officer had almost stopped her, the way the car had surged forward like a wild beast she could barely control. She had never known such fear, yet she had also never felt such determination. Every second, she had been aware that she might crash, that she might ruin the car, that she might even lose her own life. But she hadn't cared. She had only thought of the boy's tiny hand clutching at her shirt, of the way his breath grew weaker. She realized now that love, pure, selfless love, had given her the courage she never thought she possessed. After what felt like forever, a doctor finally stepped out. Angela jumped to her feet, her eyes wide with desperation. "How is he?" she asked, her voice trembling. The doctor gave a small reassuring smile. "He's stable now. We managed to control the reaction. He'll need to stay for observation, but he's out of immediate danger. Relief crashed over Angela like a wave. Her knees weakened, and she nearly stumbled, but she caught herself against the chair. Her lips trembled as she whispered, thank you so much. You should sit, the doctor advised kindly. You've done more than enough. The boy is lucky you acted so quickly. Angela nodded, sinking back into the chair, her heart swelling with gratitude. Ethan was alive. That was all that mattered. But as the minutes passed, another fear began creeping into her thoughts. News of what she had done would not remain hidden for long. The mansion staff had seen her take the car. By now, word must have spread. Richard would hear about it soon, and when he did, his reaction could change her life forever. She imagined him storming into the hospital, his face red with anger, accusing her of theft. The thought sent chills down her spine. She had risked everything, not just her job, but possibly her freedom. Yet, even with that fear pressing down on her, she knew she would do it again if it meant saving Ethan. Outside the hospital, curious onlookers were already whispering. The Lamborghini, gleaming under the hospital lights, was hard to miss. People pointed at it, wondering why such a luxurious car was parked there. Some even recognized it as belonging to the famous businessman Richard Thompson. They speculated endlessly about who had driven it and why. A few had seen Angela step out of it with the boy in her arms, and their surprised murmurs began to grow. Angela remained inside, unaware of the attention. She sat quietly, waiting for Ethan to wake up. Every now and then, she leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees and burying her face in her hands. The weight of what she had done was finally beginning to sink in. She hadn't just borrowed a car, she had broken every unspoken rule of her position. Maids didn't touch their master's belongings, let alone drive the most prized possession he owned. As the night deepened, Angela dozed lightly in the chair, exhaustion finally overtaking her. She dreamed of Ethan laughing, running through the garden with his toy car, his voice bright and happy. When she woke, she realized she was holding onto that memory like a lifeline. She prayed silently that he would soon be that cheerful boy again. She didn't notice the tall figure that had entered the hospital lobby. Richard Thompson had arrived. The news had reached him quickly, his son had collapsed, the maid had taken his Lamborghini, and she had sped through the city to bring the boy here. His face was unreadable as he strode through the corridor, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. The staff and bystanders whispered as they recognized him. Some expected an explosion of anger. Others waited to see what he would do. Angela, still half asleep, lifted her head and froze when she saw him. Her heart skipped a beat. The moment she had dreaded was finally here. Richard's eyes swept over her, then moved to the door where Ethan lay inside. For a few seconds, silence hung heavy between them. Angela wanted to speak, to explain, but the words stuck in her throat. She simply lowered her gaze, bracing herself for the storm she believed was about to fall. The moment Richard Thompson stepped into the hospital, silence seemed to follow him. His tall frame, his sharp suit, and his stern face commanded attention wherever he went. The staff at the reception desk froze, whispering his name to one another. People in the waiting area glanced up, recognizing him from the newspapers and television. He was a man of power, and power always carried a certain kind of presence that filled every corner of a room. But tonight, Richard's presence was heavier than usual. He had been called with urgent news, his only son had collapsed, and the person responsible for bringing him to the hospital was none other than his maid. Angela felt her heart pound faster as Richard's eyes met hers. She wanted to speak, to explain, but her throat felt dry. For a moment, his gaze was hard, unreadable. He glanced briefly at the Lamborghini parked outside through the glass doors, then back at her. His jaw tightened, and Angela felt her stomach twist in fear. She lowered her head, bracing herself for the worst. But Richard didn't say a word. He walked past her, straight to the doctor who had just stepped out of Ethan's room. Angela watched as the two men spoke in hushed tones. She could not hear what was being said, but she saw the doctor nodding, his expression calm and reassuring. Richard's shoulders, stiff with tension, seemed to ease slightly. After a few minutes, the doctor left, and Richard stood alone outside the door. Slowly, he opened it and stepped inside. Angela remained seated, gripping the edge of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could imagine the scene unfolding in the room, Richard seeing his son lying there with tubes and wires attached, his small chest rising and falling with the help of machines. She knew the sight would break any father's heart, even one as stern and distant as Richard Thompson. Minutes later, Richard came out again. His face was pale, but his eyes carried a fire that made Angela's breath catch. He walked toward her, his step steady but firm. She stood quickly, her knees shaking. When he finally stopped in front of her, the silence felt unbearable. "Is it true?" he asked at last, his deep voice cutting through the quiet corridor. Angela swallowed hard. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "I took your car. I didn't know what else to do." "Ethan," he couldn't breathe. "The ambulance was too far. I thought if I waited, we might lose him." "I am sorry, sir. I only wanted to save him." Richard studied her face carefully. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in thought. Angela could feel her whole life hanging in that moment. One wrong word from him could end everything: her job, her reputation, even her freedom. She waited for him to raise his voice, to accuse her of theft, to call security. But he didn't. Instead, he asked, "You drove the Lamborghini, without experience?" Angela hesitated before nodding. "Yes, sir. I have never driven such a car before. But I had to try. I couldn't let him." Her voice broke, and tears spilled down her cheeks. She quickly wiped them away, ashamed to cry in front of him. Richard's expression softened ever so slightly. He remembered something the doctor had said: if the boy had arrived even a few minutes later, the outcome would have been very different. The words echoed in his mind. This woman, this maid he barely noticed in his grand home, had done what none of his staff or even he himself could have done at that moment. She had risked everything, even her own safety, to save Ethan. Still, Richard was a man who had spent years building walls around his emotions. Gratitude did not come easily to him, and suspicion was a habit he found hard to let go of. He looked at Angela again, his voice lower now. "You realize what could have happened? You could have crashed. You could have killed yourself. You could have ruined the car." Angela lifted her chin slightly, though her hands still trembled. "I didn't think about myself, sir. I didn't think about the car either. I only thought about Ethan. If something happened to him, I could never forgive myself." For the first time, Richard saw something in Angela's eyes that struck him deeply: pure sincerity. There was no selfishness in her, no desire for gain. She was exhausted, her uniform wrinkled, her face pale, but her eyes shone with a determination that spoke louder than any excuse. He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he turned away, pacing slowly in the corridor, his hands in his pockets. Angela stood silently, unsure of what to do. Finally, Richard stopped and spoke, his voice quieter. "The doctors said he will recover. Because of you." Angela let out a shaky breath, relief flooding her. "Thank God," she whispered softly, almost to herself. Richard glanced back at her. His sharp features softened for the briefest moment. "Do you have any idea what you've done tonight?" Angela lowered her head again. "I broke your trust, sir. I took what was not mine. But if I had to choose again, I would do it without hesitation." Richard stared at her, speechless for a moment. Then he surprised her with a question she never expected. Why? Angela blinked, confused. Why, sir? Yes, he said firmly. Why risk everything for a boy who isn't even your own? Why not wait for the ambulance like everyone else? Angela took a deep breath, her voice trembling but strong. Because I love him, sir. Not the way a mother does, but the way someone who spends every day with him does. He is kind to me. He smiles at me when others don't. He reminds me of my own brother. When I saw him there, struggling to breathe, I couldn't just stand and watch. I knew if I didn't act, I would lose him. And I couldn't let that happen. Her words struck Richard in a way he didn't expect. He had always believed loyalty was bought with money, that employees served him because they needed his wealth. But Angela had just proven otherwise. She had acted not for money, not for recognition, but out of love and humanity. For a long while, Richard said nothing. He simply looked at her, his stern face unreadable. Angela stood quietly, her heart still racing, waiting for his judgment. Finally, Richard's voice broke the silence. Go sit with him. He'll want to see you when he wakes up. Angela's eyes widened. She had expected punishment, anger, maybe even dismissal. But instead, Richard had given her permission and acknowledgement that she mattered in Ethan's life. She nodded quickly, whispering, "Thank you, sir," before hurrying into Ethan's room. Inside, the boy lay peacefully, his breathing steadier now. Angela sat by his side, gently holding his small hand in hers. She felt tears roll down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of relief. She whispered softly, "You're going to be fine, Ethan. I promise." Unseen by her, Richard stood at the doorway, watching silently. For the first time in years, his eyes softened with something close to gratitude. The night passed slowly in the hospital room. Machines beeped softly, and the steady rhythm of Ethan's breathing filled the air. Angela sat quietly at his bedside, never letting go of his small hand. Every now and then, she brushed his hair gently away from his forehead and whispered words of comfort, even though he was still asleep. She had no idea how tired she looked, her eyes heavy from exhaustion, her uniform wrinkled, but her spirit unshaken. She didn't care about her own state, all that mattered was that Ethan was safe. Outside the room, Richard stood for a long time in silence. He had been watching her, unseen, from the doorway. He saw the way she leaned toward his son with genuine care, the way she prayed softly under her breath. It stirred something inside him that he had long buried. He had lost his wife years ago and had built a hard shell around himself ever since. Work had become his world, and he rarely allowed anyone into his heart, not even Ethan. Yet, watching Angela now, he realized she had done what he himself had failed to do. She had shown his son the kind of love that money could never buy. When morning light began to stream through the hospital window, Ethan finally stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, and he looked around weakly. The first face he saw was Angela's. His lips curved into a faint smile, and his voice, though weak, whispered, "Angela." Angela's heart swelled with relief. She smiled through her tears and squeezed his hand gently. "I'm here, Ethan. You're safe now." Ethan blinked slowly, then asked, "What happened?" Angela brushed his hand softly. "You had an allergy attack, sweetheart. But you're going to be all right. The doctors took care of you." Richard, who had stepped into the room, cleared his throat. Ethan turned his head slightly and saw his father. His face lit up. "Daddy," he whispered. Richard moved closer and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. For a brief moment, the usually stern man's face softened as he whispered back, "You're going to be fine, son." Angela stood respectfully, ready to step aside, but Ethan clung to her hand. "Don't go," he murmured. Richard noticed it, and though part of him felt a sting in his heart, he also realized the truth: his son trusted Angela deeply, maybe more than anyone else in the house. News of the incident had already spread beyond the mansion. Reporters had begun to gather outside the hospital, eager to know why the famous Richard Thompson's Lamborghini had been seen speeding through the city driven by a maid. Speculations filled the newspapers, and gossip spread like wildfire. Some said the maid had stolen the car. Others claimed she had kidnapped the boy. Only a few knew the truth: that she had risked her life to save him. When Richard stepped out of the hospital room later that morning, journalists rushed forward, cameras flashing and microphones shoved toward him. "Mr. Thompson, is it true your maid stole your Lamborghini?" one shouted. "What happened to your son?" another asked. "Will you press charges against her?" Richard raised his hand firmly, silencing the crowd. For the first time in years, his voice carried not just authority, but also something new: gratitude. "My son is alive today because of her," he said clearly. The crowd fell silent in surprise. "Yes, she drove my car without permission. Yes, she broke rules. But she did it to save my son's life when no one else could. If not for her courage, I might have lost him last night." The reporters stared, astonished by his words. Some quickly scribbled notes, others captured every word on camera. Richard continued, his voice steady. "I will not press charges. On the contrary, I owe her more than I can ever repay. What she did was not theft, it was bravery." The journalists murmured among themselves, their stories shifting from scandal to heroism. Richard turned away from them and went back inside, leaving them buzzing with questions. Back in Ethan's room, Angela sat quietly, unaware of the storm of attention outside. She was still worried, not about herself, but about what would happen once Ethan returned home. Would she still have a job? Would Richard really forgive her? Her thoughts swirled with uncertainty. Later that day, Richard entered the room again. Ethan had fallen asleep, so the two adults were left alone. Angela stood quickly, nervously lowering her gaze. She braced herself once again, fearing his final decision. Richard studied her for a long moment. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm but firm. "Do you know what people are saying outside? They think you stole from me. They think you broke the law." Angela's heart sank. "I am sorry, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to bring shame on your name. I only wanted to save him. I will accept whatever punishment you give me." Richard shook his head slowly. "Punishment," he repeated, almost to himself. "You call it punishment when you've just saved my son's life." His voice grew firmer. "Angela, you risked everything when others froze. You acted when I wasn't there. You showed courage most people can only talk about." Angela's eyes widened in shock. She didn't know how to respond. Richard continued, his tone softening. "I built my life believing money could solve every problem. But last night proved me wrong. Money couldn't save my son. A Lamborghini couldn't save him. You did. You, who had nothing, gave everything. I cannot ignore that." Angela felt tears spill over her cheeks. She quickly wiped them away, still unable to believe his words. "I only did what anyone with a heart would do," she whispered. Richard shook his head. "No. Many people stood around, waiting, panicking, doing nothing. You didn't. That's why you are different." He paused, then added, "From today, your life will not be the same. I won't let it be." Angela looked at him, confused. "What do you mean, sir?" Richard took a deep breath. "I'm going to help you and your family. You will no longer struggle the way you have. You will have a proper home, security, and a future. Not because you worked for me, but because you deserve it." Angela's lips parted in disbelief. She tried to protest. "But sir, I don't need anything in return." Saving Ethan was enough for me. Richard raised a hand gently. I know you didn't do it for a reward. That's why you deserve it even more. Sometimes the greatest gifts are given to those who never ask. For the first time in years, Angela felt the heavy burden of her struggles begin to lift. She thought of her siblings, how they would finally have a chance at a better life, how she could give them the education she had always dreamed for them. Gratitude swelled in her heart, but she struggled to find the right words. At that moment, Ethan stirred and opened his eyes again. Seeing his father and Angela standing together, he smiled weakly. "Daddy, Angela saved me," he said softly. Richard's eyes softened, and he leaned down to kiss his son's forehead. "Yes, son. She did. And I'll never forget it." Angela turned her face away, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. For the first time, she felt seen not as a maid, not as a servant, but as a human being whose courage had changed everything. When they finally returned to the mansion days later, things were different. The staff who once whispered behind her back now looked at her with respect. The city that once questioned her now called her a hero. And Richard Thompson, the man who once barely noticed her, treated her with honor. Angela never asked for recognition, but life had given it to her anyway. She had proven that courage and kindness were more powerful than wealth or status. And though she returned to her duties with the same humility as before, everyone who looked at her knew one thing: she was no ordinary maid. She was the woman who had dared to take a millionaire's Lamborghini, not for herself, but to save a child's life. And that single act had changed her story forever.